The dimly lit studio of The Tucker Carlson Show felt unusually quiet as Jonathan Roumie settled into the guest chair across from the veteran broadcaster. Tucker leaned back in his characteristic pose, but his usual sharp political demeanor had softened into something approaching reverence. On the table between them lay a simple wooden cross, a prop that Jonathan had brought from the set of The Chosen. Specifically from the Crucifixion scene they had just finished filming for Season 6. What Jonathan was about to share would leave Tucker speechless and challenge everything both men thought they knew about the intersection of faith and entertainment. The actor's hands trembled slightly as he prepared to reveal an encounter with the divine that had occurred just days earlier on set. "Jonathan," Tucker began, his voice unusually gentle, "you've been playing Jesus Christ for 5 seasons now, and millions of people around the world have been moved by your portrayal." He gestured toward the wooden cross on the table. "But you called me yesterday and said something happened during the filming of the crucifixion scene that you've never experienced before, something that went far beyond acting." Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the cross as if drawing strength from it. "Tucker, what I'm about to share might sound impossible to some people, but I can't stay silent about it. Something happened on that set that changed me forever." Have you ever wondered what it would be like to experience the crucifixion not just as an observer, but as someone walking in the very footsteps of Christ? What happens when an actor's portrayal becomes so real that the line between performance and spiritual encounter disappears completely? This is the extraordinary account of Jonathan Roumie's supernatural experience while filming the most sacred scene in Christian history. A moment that left the entire cast and crew questioning everything they thought they knew about faith, suffering, and the presence of God. Tucker shifted forward in his chair, his journalist instincts fully engaged, despite the spiritual nature of the conversation. "Before we get to what happened during filming, help our audience understand the preparation that went into this scene." He studied Jonathan's face, noting the profound change in the actor's demeanor since their last interview months earlier. The crucifixion is arguably the most important moment in human history for Christians. How do you even begin to prepare for something like that? Jonathan took a deep breath, his fingers unconsciously tracing the wood grain of the cross on the table. "Tucker, I've been preparing for the scene spiritually and emotionally for 5 years." Jonathan replied, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there in previous interviews. "But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what actually happened when the cameras started rolling." He paused, collecting his thoughts as memories of that day flooded back. Dallas Jenkins, our creator and director, had told the entire cast and crew that this would be different from any other day of filming. He asked everyone to approach it with reverence, to remember that we weren't just making television, we were depicting the moment that changed everything. The preparation had been months in the making, with Jonathan working closely with theologians, historians, and medical experts to understand every aspect of what Jesus experienced. He had studied the physical effects of crucifixion, the emotional weight of bearing humanity's sins, and the spiritual significance of Christ's sacrifice. "I read everything I could get my hands on," Jonathan explained to Tucker. "Medical journals describing the physiological effects of crucifixion, theological treatises on the atonement, historical accounts of Roman execution methods." But even with all that preparation, nothing had prepared him for the spiritual dimension of what was about to unfold. Tucker leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You've talked before about how playing Jesus has deepened your own faith, but this sounds like something entirely different." Jonathan nodded emphatically. "This wasn't just about acting or even about faith deepening. This was about experiencing something that I can only describe as supernatural." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Tucker, I need you to understand, I'm not someone who claims to have visions or supernatural experiences. I'm an actor who takes his craft seriously and his faith seriously, but I've always kept those two things separate, until this day." The filming of the crucifixion scene had been scheduled for 3 days, with elaborate sets constructed to recreate Golgotha as accurately as possible. The production team had consulted with biblical archaeologists to ensure historical authenticity, down to the type of wood used for the cross and the specific methods of Roman crucifixion. When I arrived on set that first morning, Jonathan continued, there was a palpable sense of solemnity among everyone present. Even the crew members who weren't particularly religious seemed to understand they were participating in something sacred. Tucker interrupted with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Jonathan, you've been portraying Jesus for years now. What made this particular scene different? The actor considered the question carefully before responding. Every other scene I've filmed, no matter how intense or emotional, I've always maintained some level of awareness that I was acting. There's always been a part of my mind that remained Jonathan Roumie, watching myself portray Jesus. He picked up the wooden cross, holding it gently. But from the moment they placed this cross on my shoulders, that awareness began to fade. The first day of filming had gone relatively smoothly, with the crew capturing the journey to Golgotha and the initial preparations for crucifixion. Jonathan described feeling emotionally drained, but not experiencing anything beyond what he might expect from such an intense scene. I thought I understood what we were doing, he told Tucker. I thought I was prepared for the emotional and physical demands of the role. But as he prepared for bed that first night, Jonathan felt an unusual heaviness settling over him. Not just exhaustion from the day's work, but something deeper and more profound. That night, I couldn't sleep, Jonathan continued, his voice taking on a distant quality as he remembered. I kept thinking about the weight of what we were depicting, about the reality of what Jesus actually went through, and I found myself praying in a way I never had before, not just for the strength to portray the scene well, but for the grace to honor what really happened on that hill 2,000 years ago. Tucker listened intently, recognizing that his guest was sharing something deeply personal and potentially controversial for his career. The second day of filming focused on the actual crucifixion, the nailing to the cross, and the raising of it. The production team had worked with stunt coordinators and medical advisors to ensure Jonathan's safety while maintaining the realism of the scene. They had rigged a special harness system that would support my weight while making it appear that I was actually hanging from the cross, Jonathan explained. But even with all the safety measures, the physical position was incredibly uncomfortable and painful. What he didn't expect was how the physical discomfort would open a door to something far beyond his experience. Tucker leaned forward again, his curiosity evident. Walk me through what happened when they actually put you on the cross. Jonathan's expression grew distant, as if he were reliving the moment. The crew was incredibly respectful. Before we began filming, Dallas called for a moment of silence. 200 people on set, cast, crew, extras, all stood quietly for several minutes. He paused, his voice becoming softer. Then they began the process of positioning me on the cross, and that's when everything changed. As the cameras began rolling, and Jonathan assumed the position of Christ on the cross, something inexplicable began to happen. Tucker, I know how this is going to sound, but I have to tell you the truth, Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. As I hung there, portraying the physical agony of crucifixion, I began to experience something that went far beyond acting. It was as if I could feel the spiritual weight of what Jesus actually carried on that cross. Tucker's eyebrows raised, but he remained silent, sensing the profound nature of what his guest was sharing. The sensation Jonathan described wasn't just physical pain, though that was certainly present despite the safety harnesses. I began to feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Not my own sorrow, but something infinitely deeper, he explained to Tucker. It was as if I could sense the grief of God over the brokenness of humanity, the weight of every sin, every act of cruelty, every moment of despair that had ever existed or would exist. His voice broke slightly as he continued, and Tucker, it was almost unbearable. I understand now why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Tucker, known for his sharp interviewing style, found himself at a loss for words. Jonathan, are you saying you believe you experienced something of what Jesus actually felt during the crucifixion? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with theological and personal implications. Jonathan met his gaze directly. I'm saying that something happened on that set that I cannot explain through normal means, whether it was God allowing me to experience a fraction of what Christ endured, or whether it was my imagination enhanced by the intense nature of the scene. I can't say for certain. But I can tell you that it was real, and it changed me. The experience had been so intense that Jonathan had initially thought he might be having some kind of medical emergency. At one point, I signaled to Dallas that I needed them to cut, he told Tucker. The weight of what I was feeling was so overwhelming that I thought I might pass out. But when the crew rushed to check on him, something extraordinary happened. Dallas Jenkins, who had been watching the scene unfold through the camera monitors, had tears streaming down his face. He told me later that what he was seeing through the lens wasn't just acting, it was something else entirely. Tucker shook his head in amazement. And this happened in front of a crew of 200 people? Jonathan nodded. That's what makes it even more remarkable. This wasn't a private moment of prayer or meditation. This was happening in front of cameras, with lighting equipment and sound crews and all the technical aspects of filmmaking going on around us. He paused, remembering the profound stillness that had settled over the set. But somehow, none of that seemed to matter. It was as if we had all been transported to another time and place. The most profound moment came when Jonathan was delivering the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Tucker, I've said those words dozens of times in rehearsal and in previous takes, he explained, but when I spoke them during this particular take, something broke open inside me. Tears began to form in his eyes as he remembered the moment. I felt an overwhelming love. Not human love, but something divine, flowing through me toward every person who has ever lived. It was as if I could see humanity through God's eyes, with all our flaws and failures, and yet feel nothing but compassion and forgiveness. Tucker sat back in his chair, clearly moved by what he was hearing. Jonathan, you're describing something that sounds almost mystical. How did the rest of the cast and crew react? The actor managed a small smile. That's one of the most remarkable parts of this whole experience. When Dallas finally called cut, there wasn't the usual bustle of activity that follows a scene. The entire set was silent. He paused, remembering the profound quiet that had settled over everyone present. People were just standing there, many of them crying, as if they had witnessed something sacred. If you're still here listening to this incredible testimony, if Jonathan's experience is touching something deep in your own heart, go ahead and hit that like button and comment the word encounter below. Let's see how many of us believe that God still breaks through in unexpected ways, that the sacred can intersect with it every day, and that sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences happen when we least expect them. One of the most striking aspects of Jonathan's account was how it affected people of various faith backgrounds who were present on set. We had crew members who weren't religious, some who were skeptical about faith, and others who came from different religious traditions, he told Tucker. But something happened that day that transcended those differences. People who had worked together for years were having conversations about God and spirituality that they had never had before. The experience seemed to create a space where the sacred became accessible to everyone present, regardless of their personal beliefs. Tucker pressed for more details about the specific sensations Jonathan had experienced. When you say you felt the weight of humanity's sin, can you describe that more concretely? Jonathan struggled to find words adequate to the experience. It was like carrying an enormous burden that wasn't physical but was somehow heavier than any physical weight could be, he explained. I felt the pain of every broken relationship, every act of violence, every moment of despair and hopelessness. But somehow, alongside that crushing weight, I also felt an inexplicable hope, as if this suffering was not meaningless, but was somehow accomplishing something redemptive. The theological implications of what Jonathan was describing weren't lost on either man. You're talking about experiencing what Christians call the substitutionary atonement, Tucker observed. The idea that Christ took on himself the punishment for humanity's sins. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. Tucker, I've read about that doctrine, I've heard sermons about it, I thought I understood it intellectually. But what I experienced on that cross gave me a glimpse of the reality behind the theology. It wasn't just a transaction or a legal arrangement, it was an act of love so profound that it defies human comprehension. As they continued their conversation, Jonathan described how the experience had affected his understanding of his role in The Chosen. For 5 seasons, I've been honored to portray Jesus, but I've always maintained a healthy separation between the character and myself, he explained to Tucker. I never wanted to cross the line into thinking I was somehow special or chosen in a messianic sense. But the crucifixion scene had challenged that careful boundary. For those hours on the cross, that separation disappeared. I wasn't acting as Jesus, I was somehow participating in his experience. Tucker, known for his skeptical approach to most topics, found himself struggling with how to respond to Jonathan's account. I have to ask the obvious question, he said carefully. How do you distinguish between what might have been an intense psychological experience brought on by the circumstances, and what you're suggesting might have been an actual spiritual encounter? It was a fair question, and Jonathan had been wrestling with it himself since the filming concluded. Tucker, that's the question I've been asking myself every day since this happened, Jonathan replied honestly. As an actor, I know how deeply you can become immersed in a character. I understand the psychological processes that can occur during intense emotional scenes. He picked up the wooden cross again, turning it over in his hands. But this was different. This wasn't me accessing emotional memories or using acting techniques to generate feelings. This was something being given to me from outside myself, something I had no control over and couldn't have produced on my own. The conversation turned to how the experience had affected Jonathan's personal faith. Has this changed how you pray, how you read scripture, how you think about God? Tucker asked. Jonathan's response was immediate and heartfelt. Tucker, it's changed everything. When I read the crucifixion accounts in the Gospels now, they're not just historical narratives. They're windows into an experience I somehow participated in. His voice grew stronger as he continued. My prayers have become more urgent, more grateful, more aware of the cost of my salvation. I can't take it for granted anymore. One of the most profound changes Jonathan described was in his understanding of suffering. Before this experience, I struggled with the problem of pain like most people do, he told Tucker. Why does God allow suffering? Why doesn't he intervene in human tragedy? But hanging on that cross, even in a film set recreation, had given him a different perspective. I began to understand that God doesn't stand apart from human suffering. He entered into it fully. Every pain we experience, he has experienced. Every sorrow we carry, he has carried. Tucker leaned forward, genuinely moved by what he was hearing. Jonathan, you're describing something that sounds like a mystical experience. But you're also a public figure in an industry that's often skeptical of religious claims. Weren't you concerned about sharing this publicly? The question touched on the very real professional risks Jonathan was taking by sharing his story. In an entertainment industry often hostile to faith, claiming a supernatural encounter could be career suicide. Tucker, I wrestled with that question for weeks, Jonathan admitted. My agents, my publicist, several close friends all advised me to keep this private. They worried about how it might be received, how it might affect future opportunities. He paused, his expression growing resolute. But I kept coming back to the same conclusion. If God gave me this experience, if he allowed me to glimpse something of what Christ endured for humanity, then I have an obligation to share it, regardless of the personal cost. The weight of that decision was evident in Jonathan's voice as he continued. There are people watching The Chosen who are struggling with doubt, who are wrestling with whether any of this is real. If my experience can help even one person understand the depth of God's love for them, then whatever professional risks I'm taking are worth it. Tucker nodded, recognizing the courage it took to share something so personal and potentially controversial on national television. As their conversation deepened, Jonathan revealed another aspect of his experience that had been particularly moving. While I was on the cross, I found myself thinking about specific people. Some I knew personally, Others I had only heard about through prayer requests or news stories, he told Tucker. People who were suffering from illness, families torn apart by addiction, children who had been abused or abandoned. The specificity of these thoughts had surprised him during the filming. It was as if I could see each person's face clearly, could feel their individual pain, Jonathan continued. And with each face that came to mind, I felt this overwhelming desire to take their suffering on myself, to somehow absorb their pain so they wouldn't have to carry it anymore. The theological implications of what he was describing, experiencing something of Christ's intercession for humanity, were profound and deeply moving. Tucker wiped his eyes, clearly affected by the account. That's exactly what Christians believe Jesus did on the cross, took on the suffering of the world. Jonathan nodded. But Tucker, until I experienced even a fraction of it myself, I don't think I truly understood what that meant. It wasn't just a theological concept or metaphor. It was a literal, visceral reality. The Son of God willingly took on himself every pain, every sorrow, every sin that had ever existed or would exist. The physical aspects of the filming had been challenging enough, but Jonathan described how the spiritual dimensions had been far more intense. My body was exhausted from the position and the emotional intensity, but it was my soul that felt wrung out, he explained to Tucker. It was as if I had been carrying weights I couldn't see, burdens that belonged to other people, sorrows that spanned centuries. The experience had left him with a profound appreciation for what theologians call the cup that Jesus prayed about in the Garden of Gethsemane. Tucker asked about the moment when Jonathan delivered Jesus' final words from the cross. When you said, "It is finished," what was happening internally? The question brought tears to Jonathan's eyes as he remembered. Tucker, those words felt like they were coming through me, rather than from me. And as I spoke them, I felt this incredible sense of completion, of a mission accomplished, despite the cost. He paused, struggling to articulate the indescribable. It was as if I could sense the victory that was being won through what appeared to be defeat. The aftermath of the filming had been almost as intense as the experience itself. When they finally lowered me from the cross and removed all the equipment, I couldn't speak for about 20 minutes, Jonathan told Tucker. I just sat there in my trailer, trying to process what had happened. Several cast and crew members had checked on him, concerned about his condition, but he found himself unable to explain what he had experienced. Dallas Jenkins, the creator and director of The Chosen, had been particularly affected by what he had witnessed. Dallas told me later that watching through the camera, he felt like he was seeing something beyond performance, Jonathan shared. He said there were moments when he forgot he was directing a television show and felt like he was witnessing the actual crucifixion. The director had apparently been so moved that he had called for several extended breaks, giving both Jonathan and the crew time to process the intensity of what was unfolding. Tucker pressed for more details about how others on set had reacted. You mentioned that people of different faith backgrounds were affected. Can you give me specific examples? Jonathan nodded, clearly moved by the memories. One of our camera operators, who had told me months earlier that he was an atheist, came up to me after we wrapped and said he needed to know more about Jesus. A makeup artist who practices Buddhism said she had never felt such a sense of peace and love in one place. The universal nature of people's responses suggested that something beyond normal filmmaking had occurred. One of the most remarkable responses had come from the extras playing Roman soldiers. These were professional actors who had been hired to portray the soldiers who crucified Jesus, Jonathan explained. But during the filming, several of them broke character and began weeping. One man, who was supposed to be mocking Jesus, found himself unable to continue the scene because he was overcome with emotion. The blurring of lines between performance and reality had affected everyone present. Tucker shook his head in amazement. Jonathan, what you're describing sounds like a revival meeting more than a film set. The comparison wasn't lost on Jonathan. That's exactly what it felt like at times. There were moments when the filming stopped being about television production and became something closer to worship. He described how spontaneous prayers had broken out among the crew, how people who barely knew each other were embracing and sharing their own faith struggles. The experience had also profoundly affected Jonathan's relationships with his fellow cast members. The actors playing the disciples were all present during the Crucifixion filming, and every one of them was deeply moved by what they witnessed, he told Tucker. Several of them told me later that they felt like they had actually watched their friend and teacher die. The bonds formed among the cast had always been strong, but the crucifixion scenes had deepened those relationships in unexpected ways. Particularly moving had been the reaction of the actress playing Mary, Jesus' mother. She was positioned at the foot of the cross during several takes, and I could see her genuine anguish as she watched the scene unfold, Jonathan shared. At one point, she called out "my son" with such heartbreak that it stopped filming for 10 minutes while we all composed ourselves. The maternal grief portrayed had felt authentic in ways that transcended acting. Tucker asked about the technical aspects of capturing such an emotional scene. How did the cameras and sound equipment handle what was happening? Jonathan smiled slightly. That's another remarkable part of this story. The technical team said later that they had never recorded audio so clear or captured footage so compelling. It was as if even the equipment was somehow blessed by what was taking place. The sound engineer had reported something particularly unusual during the filming of Jesus' final words. He told me that when I spoke, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," the audio equipment picked up something he couldn't explain, Jonathan revealed. There was a resonance, an echo in my voice that wasn't there during any of the other takes. He said it sounded like two voices speaking in perfect harmony. Tucker leaned forward, clearly intrigued by this detail. Jonathan was careful to emphasize that he wasn't claiming any special spiritual authority because of his experience. "Tucker, I want to be very clear about something. I don't believe this happened because I'm particularly holy or deserving. If anything, I think it happened despite my flaws and limitations." His humility was evident as he continued. "I believe God chose to reveal himself in this way, to encourage not just me, but everyone who would hear this story. It's a reminder that he is still active in our world, still breaking through in unexpected ways." The conversation turned to how the experience had affected Jonathan's approach to the remaining scenes of The Chosen. "Has this changed how you prepare for other scenes as Jesus?" Tucker asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. "Every scene feels more weighty now, more significant. I can't approach any moment of portraying Jesus casually anymore." He described a new sense of responsibility, not just to the character or the story, but to the truth of who Jesus actually is. "When I'm filming scenes of Jesus healing the sick or comforting the grieving, I remember what I felt on that cross. The overwhelming love and compassion that seemed to flow through me," Jonathan explained. "It's helped me understand that every interaction Jesus had with people was an expression of that same heart that was willing to suffer and die for them." The crucifixion experience had become a lens through which he now viewed all of Christ's ministry. Tucker asked about the specific moment when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This was perhaps the most theologically complex moment in the crucifixion narrative, and Jonathan's response revealed the depth of his experience. "Tucker, when I spoke those words, I felt something I can only describe as cosmic abandonment. For just a moment, it was as if every source of comfort, every connection to divine love was severed. The theological concept of Christ bearing the full weight of sin's separation from God had become experientially real." "But here's what was remarkable," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. "Even in that moment of apparent abandonment, there was an underlying trust, a confidence that this separation was temporary and purposeful. It was abandonment experienced within the context of absolute love." The paradox he was describing, experiencing both divine abandonment and divine love simultaneously, was at the heart of the mystery of the crucifixion. Tucker pressed for more details about the physical sensations Jonathan had experienced. "You mentioned feeling the weight of sin. Can you describe what that actually felt like physically?" Jonathan struggled to find adequate words. It was like carrying water, but infinitely heavier. Every breath became difficult, not just because of the position on the cross, but because of this invisible burden that seemed to increase with each passing moment. The metaphysical had somehow become physical in ways he still couldn't fully understand. The experience had also given Jonathan new insight into the significance of Jesus' words of forgiveness from the cross. When I spoke the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," I felt this incredible release, he told Tucker. It was as if speaking forgiveness, while experiencing the full weight of humanity's brokenness, somehow broke the power of that brokenness. The transformative power of forgiveness had become more than a theological concept. It had become a lived reality. One aspect of the experience that had particularly surprised Jonathan was the sense of joy that had somehow coexisted with the agony. "Tucker, this might sound strange, but alongside all the pain and sorrow, there was this deep, underlying joy," he explained. "Not happiness, that would have been inappropriate, but a profound sense of purpose being fulfilled, of love being demonstrated in the most costly way possible." The theological concept of the cross as both tragedy and triumph had been made real in his experience. Tucker asked about the moment when Jesus commended his spirit to the Father. What was it like to speak those final words? Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he remembered. It was like coming home. All the weight, all the pain, all the separation, it all fell away. There was this incredible sense of completion, of a task finished, of love expressed in its fullest form. The transition from agony to peace had been instantaneous and overwhelming. The aftermath of filming had required several days of recovery, both physically and emotionally. "I couldn't work for 3 days after we finished the crucifixion scenes," Jonathan told Tucker. "Not because of physical exhaustion, though that was certainly present, but because I needed time to process what had happened spiritually." He had spent those days in prayer and reflection, trying to understand the significance of what he had experienced. Dallas Jenkins had given the entire cast and crew those same 3 days off, recognizing that everyone needed time to process what they had witnessed. Dallas said later that he had never experienced anything like it in 20 years of filmmaking, Jonathan shared. He felt a responsibility to honor what had occurred by giving everyone space to reflect and process. The decision had been unprecedented in the production of The Chosen, but it had felt necessary given the sacred nature of what had unfolded. Tucker asked about any skepticism Jonathan had encountered when sharing his story with others. "Not everyone has received this account positively," Jonathan acknowledged honestly. "Some people think I'm either delusional or seeking publicity. Others worry that I'm crossing a line between entertainment and claiming prophetic authority." The criticism had been painful, but not unexpected, given the extraordinary nature of his claims. "But Tucker, I keep coming back to the same truth," Jonathan continued with conviction. "I know what I experienced, I know it was real, and I know it wasn't generated by my own mind or emotions." His certainty wasn't arrogant, but carried the quiet confidence of someone who had encountered something beyond his ability to manufacture or control. If sharing this story helps even one person understand the depth of God's love for them, then whatever criticism I face is worth it. The conversation turned to the theological implications of Jonathan's experience. What does it mean that God would allow a modern actor to experience something of what Christ went through? Tucker asked. It was a question that had profound implications for how Christians understand divine revelation and contemporary spiritual experience. Jonathan had clearly wrestled with this question extensively. "I don't think God was showing me anything new," Jonathan replied thoughtfully. "The truth of what Christ accomplished on the cross has always been there, recorded in Scripture, preserved in church teaching. But I think sometimes God chooses to make ancient truths experientially real for people in ways that can touch hearts and minds in our current cultural moment." His response demonstrated both theological sophistication and appropriate humility. Tucker observed that Jonathan's account sounded similar to mystical experiences described by saints throughout church history. "Do you see any parallels between what you experienced and what contemplatives like John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila wrote about?" The comparison was apt, and Jonathan had indeed found comfort in reading about similar experiences from church history. Reading about their encounters with God has helped me understand that what I experienced wasn't unprecedented, Jonathan confirmed. Throughout history, God has chosen to give certain people glimpses of spiritual realities that normally remain hidden. I don't claim to be at their level of holiness or spiritual maturity, but I do believe I was given a gift that I'm called to share responsibly. His humility in placing his experience within the broader context of Christian mystical tradition was evident. The practical implications of the experience had been significant for Jonathan's daily life. "Tucker, you can't experience something like that and remain unchanged," he explained. "My prayer life has deepened, my reading of scripture has become more urgent, my sense of purpose has been clarified." The transformation wasn't just spiritual, but had affected every aspect of his life and relationships. Jonathan described how the experience had affected his relationships with family and friends. "My closest relationships have been strengthened because I'm more conscious of how precious each person is to God," he told Tucker. "But it's also been challenging because not everyone understands or believes what I've shared with them." The social implications of claiming such an extraordinary spiritual experience had created both deeper connections and some strained relationships. Tucker asked about how the experience might affect the final episodes of The Chosen. "Will audiences be able to see the difference in your portrayal after what you've experienced?" Jonathan smiled slightly. "I think people will notice something different, though they may not be able to articulate what it is. There's an authenticity now that wasn't there before, not because I was being inauthentic previously, but because I now understand what I'm portraying from the inside, rather than just from study and imagination." The technical team had already noticed differences in the footage captured after the Crucifixion experience. "The director of photography told me that something about my presence on camera has changed," Jonathan shared. "He said there's a depth in my eyes, a weight in my expressions, that wasn't there in earlier seasons." The internal transformation was somehow being captured by the cameras in ways that would be visible to audiences. Jonathan had been particularly moved by letters and messages from viewers who had already heard about his experience through word of mouth. "People are writing to tell me that just hearing about what happened has strengthened their own faith," he told Tucker. "Some have said it's helped them understand the crucifixion in ways they never had before." The ripple effects of his experience were already touching lives around the world. One letter that had particularly moved Jonathan came from a mother whose teenage son had been questioning his faith. She wrote that when she shared my story with her son, it opened up conversations about God that they hadn't been able to have for years, he explained. The reality of God breaking through in unexpected ways had somehow made faith seem possible again for this young man. Stories like this confirmed Jonathan's decision to share his experience publicly, despite the risks. Tucker asked about any ongoing effects Jonathan was still experiencing from his time on the cross. Has the spiritual intensity continued, or was it limited to that day of filming? The question touched on whether extraordinary spiritual experiences have lasting effects, or are meant to be momentary glimpses of divine reality. The intensity of that specific day hasn't continued, Jonathan replied honestly. But the memory of it, the understanding I gained, the certainty I now have about God's love, those have become permanent parts of who I am. He described it as being like a mountaintop experience that provides perspective and strength for daily life in the valley. I can't live at that level of spiritual intensity constantly, but I can draw on the truth of what I experienced when I need to remember what's really important. The conversation turned to how Jonathan's experience related to the broader cultural conversation about faith and spirituality. In a society that's increasingly skeptical about religion, what do you hope people take away from your story? Tucker asked. It was a question that got to the heart of why Jonathan had chosen to share something so personal and potentially controversial. Tucker, I think people are hungry for evidence that the spiritual realm is real, that there's more to existence than what we can see and measure, Jonathan responded. My experience won't convince everyone, and I don't expect it to. But for those who are open to it, it might serve as confirmation that God is still active in our world, still revealing himself to people who seek him. His hope was modest but sincere, that his story might encourage others in their own spiritual journeys. Jonathan had been struck by how many people had told him they had their own supernatural experiences, but had been afraid to share them. Since I've started talking about this, I've been amazed by how many people have approached me with their own stories of divine encounters, he told Tucker. It's as if giving permission for the sacred to break through into everyday life has encouraged others to acknowledge what they've experienced. The courage to speak about the supernatural seemed to be contagious. Tucker asked about the specific details of how the presence of God had felt during the crucifixion scene. When you say you sensed God's presence, can you describe what that was like? Jonathan struggled with the limitations of language to describe transcendent experience. It was like being completely known and completely loved simultaneously, he explained. Every flaw, every failure, every dark thought I'd ever had was somehow visible, but instead of condemnation, there was only compassion and acceptance. The experience of divine love had been overwhelming in its completeness. A sense of time had also been affected during the most intense moments of filming. There were periods when I lost all awareness of the cameras, the crew, even the fact that we were making a television show, Jonathan told Tucker. It felt like I was existing outside of normal time, in a space where past, present, and future somehow converged. He described moments that felt like hours, but were actually only minutes, and other stretches where time seemed to stop entirely. It was as if I was experiencing eternity, while still being bound by the physical constraints of filming. Tucker leaned back, clearly processing the enormity of what he was hearing. Jonathan, you're describing something that challenges everything most people understand about the nature of reality. The journalist's usual skepticism had given way to genuine wonder at the account his guest was sharing. How do you reconcile what you experienced with the practical demands of your career and daily life? It was a question that got to the heart of how extraordinary spiritual experiences integrate with ordinary human existence. That's been one of the biggest challenges, Jonathan admitted. How do you go back to worrying about Paul times and script changes and industry politics after you've experienced something that puts all of that in eternal perspective? He described the struggle of returning to normal life after what felt like a glimpse behind the veil of reality. But I think that's part of the purpose, to bring that perspective into everyday life, to remember what's truly important when the world tries to convince us that temporary things are ultimate. The experience had also affected Jonathan's understanding of his own mortality in profound ways. Hanging on that cross, experiencing even a fraction of what Jesus endured, gave me a completely different relationship with the idea of death, he told Tucker. It's not that I'm no longer afraid of dying, but I understand now that death isn't the end of the story. There's something beyond physical existence that's more real than anything we experience here. The theological concept of eternal life had become experientially grounded. Tucker asked about whether Jonathan had experienced any visions or seen anything beyond the physical set during his time on the cross. Did you see anything that others couldn't see? The question touched on one of the most mysterious aspects of mystical experience, whether spiritual encounters include visual elements beyond normal perception. There were moments when the set seemed to fade away, and I felt like I was actually on Golgotha 2,000 years ago. Jonathan replied carefully, I can't say definitively whether I saw anything that wasn't physically there, but I felt transported to that time and place in ways that went beyond imagination or acting technique. He described sensing the presence of the actual disciples, feeling the grief of Mary and the other women who had watched Jesus die. One of the most profound aspects of the experience had been sensing the spiritual battle that was taking place around the crucifixion. I became aware of forces of darkness that were celebrating what they thought was their victory, and forces of light that knew something greater was being accomplished, Jonathan explained to Tucker. It was like being in the middle of a cosmic conflict that was invisible to physical eyes but absolutely real spiritually. The theological concept of the cross as the decisive battle between good and evil had become experientially real, Tucker asked about the moment when Jesus declared, "It is finished." You mentioned feeling a sense of completion when you spoke those words. Can you elaborate on that? The question addressed what many theologians consider the most significant declaration in human history, the announcement that Christ's atoning work was complete. When I spoke those words, Tucker, it was as if I could feel the completion of every promise God had ever made. Jonathan replied, his voice filled with awe at the memory. Every prophecy about the Messiah, every sacrifice in the Old Testament, every human longing for redemption, it all came together in that moment. He described feeling like he was participating in the culmination of all of human history. And there was this incredible sense of triumph, even in the midst of apparent defeat. Victory was being won through surrender. Life was coming through death. The theological paradoxes that had been intellectually challenging for Jonathan as an actor became experientially clear during his time on the cross. Things that had seemed contradictory before. How Jesus could be both fully human and fully divine. How the cross could represent both ultimate suffering and ultimate victory. Suddenly made perfect sense, he told Tucker. Not because I understood them intellectually, but because I was somehow participating in those mysteries. Tucker asked about how Jonathan's experience related to the doubts and questions that many Christians wrestle with. For people who struggle with whether any of this is real, what would you say to them based on what you've experienced? It was a question that went to the heart of faith and doubt, belief and skepticism. I would say that doubt is not the enemy of faith, Jonathan replied thoughtfully. I had plenty of doubts before this experience, and I still have questions about many things. But what I experienced has given me an anchor, a reference point that I can return to when doubt threatens to overwhelm me. He described his encounter as providing not all the answers, but enough certainty about God's love to sustain faith through the questions that remain. The universality of what Jonathan had experienced was something that continued to strike him. Tucker, what I felt on that cross wasn't just love for Christians or good people, he emphasized. It was love for every human being who has ever lived or will live. The forgiveness Jesus offered wasn't conditional or limited. It was as vast as humanity itself. This understanding had profound implications for how he now viewed people of different faiths, or those who claimed no faith at all. Tucker pressed on this point. So you're saying that what you experienced suggests God's love extends beyond traditional religious boundaries? It was a potentially controversial theological territory, but Jonathan's response was measured and thoughtful. I'm saying that the love I experienced was bigger than any human category or boundary. That doesn't mean all paths lead to God or that truth doesn't matter, but it does mean that God's heart for humanity is larger than we often imagine. The conversation turned to how Jonathan's experience might be received by different Christian denominations and theological traditions. Have you shared this with pastors or theologians? What has their response been? Tucker asked. The question touched on how extraordinary spiritual experiences are evaluated and validated within established religious communities. I've spoken with several pastors and biblical scholars about what happened, Jonathan confirmed. The responses have been mixed but generally supportive. Most have encouraged me to share the experience while being careful to ground it in Scripture and not claim any authority beyond what I actually experienced. He had been particularly grateful for spiritual mentors who helped him process the experience within the broader context of Christian theology and tradition. One theologian had told Jonathan that his experience sounded consistent with what mystics throughout church history had described when given glimpses of Christ's passion. He helped me understand that God has sometimes chosen to give people experiential understanding of theological truths that might otherwise remain merely intellectual, Jonathan explained. Not to add to revelation, but to make existing revelation more real and personal. Tucker asked about any lasting physical effects from the intensity of the spiritual experience. Did the emotional and spiritual weight of what you experienced affect you physically? The question addressed the connection between spiritual and physical reality that many people experience during intense religious encounters. For several days after filming, I felt physically drained in ways that went beyond normal exhaustion, Jonathan replied. It was as if my whole being, body, mind, and spirit, had been stretched to its limits. He described symptoms that were difficult to categorize medically, but were clearly related to the intensity of his spiritual experience. My doctor said all my vital signs were normal, but I felt like I was recovering from something that had affected me at a cellular level. The experience had also affected Jonathan's sleep and dream life in the weeks following the filming. I had incredibly vivid dreams about biblical events, about conversations with Jesus, about the reality of heaven and eternal life, he told Tucker. Not nightmares, but dreams so real that I would wake up feeling like I had actually been transported to another realm. These ongoing effects suggested that his encounter had opened spiritual channels that remained active long after the initial experience. Tucker asked about how the experience had affected Jonathan's relationships with his fellow cast members. Has sharing this experience brought you closer to the other actors, or has it created distance? The question addressed how extraordinary spiritual claims can affect personal relationships, even within a faith-based production. Most of the cast has been incredibly supportive, Jonathan replied. Many of them witnessed what happened on set, so they know I'm not making this up. If anything, it's deepened our sense of purpose about what we're doing with The Chosen. He described how the experience had elevated the entire production's understanding of their work from entertainment to ministry. We all feel more responsible now for faithfully representing these sacred stories. Some cast members had shared their own spiritual experiences that had occurred during the filming of various scenes. It turns out I'm not the only one who has felt God's presence in unusual ways during production, Jonathan revealed. Others have had their own encounters, though perhaps not as dramatic as what I experienced during the Crucifixion. The accumulation of spiritual experiences across the cast and crew suggested that something significant was happening through the production of the show. Tucker asked about the specific moment when Jonathan felt God's presence most intensely during the Crucifixion filming. Was there a particular second or minute when the spiritual experience peaked? The question sought to identify the climax of what had clearly been an extended supernatural encounter. It was when I was hanging there in complete silence, before any of the dialogue, Jonathan replied, his voice growing quiet with reverence. For about 30 seconds, everything else fell away. The cameras, the crew, the awareness that I was acting, and I felt completely united with Christ's experience. He described those moments as the most profound of his entire life. I understood, not intellectually, but experientially, what it meant for God to forsake his Son so that he would never have to forsake us. The theological implications of experiencing divine abandonment while simultaneously feeling divine love had been particularly challenging for Jonathan to process. How can you feel forsaken by God and loved by God at the same time? He asked Tucker, but somehow, on that cross, both were true. The abandonment was real, but it was purposeful, redemptive, motivated by perfect love. The paradox remained mysterious but was no longer intellectually troubling. Tucker observed that Jonathan's account sounded similar to near-death experiences that some people report. Do you think what you experienced was related to that phenomenon? The comparison was interesting, though Jonathan felt his experience was distinctly different from typical near-death accounts he had read about. There are some similarities: the sense of being outside normal time and space, the overwhelming experience of divine love, Jonathan acknowledged. But this wasn't about my own death or transition. It was about participating in someone else's death. Specifically, in the death that conquered death itself. You felt that his experience was more about entering into historical and theological reality than about personal transcendence. The conversation turned to how Jonathan's experience might affect viewers of The Chosen when the Crucifixion episodes eventually air. Do you think audiences will be able to sense that something extraordinary happened during filming? Tucker asked. The question addressed whether spiritual authenticity could be transmitted through television screens. I believe they will, Jonathan replied with quiet confidence. Not everyone will be able to articulate what they're seeing, but I think many people will sense that what they're watching is more than just acting. He described conversations with editors and post-production staff, who had said the footage from the crucifixion scenes felt different from anything else they had worked with. There's a presence in the images that seems to go beyond what the cameras captured. Tucker asked about any specific messages or insights Jonathan felt called to share based on his experience. If God gave you this encounter to share with others, what do you think He wants people to know? The question addressed the prophetic dimension of extraordinary spiritual experiences and their purpose for the broader community. I think He wants people to know that the crucifixion wasn't just a historical event or a theological concept. It was an act of love so profound that it continues to reverberate through time. Jonathan replied, "Every person who has ever felt abandoned, rejected, or condemned needs to know that God entered into those experiences fully so that we would never have to face them alone." His message was both deeply personal and universally applicable. The experience had also given Jonathan new insight into the resurrection. Understanding the depth of what Jesus experienced on the cross has made the reality of Easter morning even more magnificent, he told Tucker. Death wasn't just defeated abstractly, it was conquered by someone who had experienced its full power and emerged victorious. The theological connection between Good Friday and Easter Sunday had become experientially grounded. Tucker asked about any skeptics who had challenged Jonathan's account directly. Have you faced criticism from people who think you're either delusional or seeking publicity? The question addressed the inevitable pushback that comes with public claims about supernatural experiences. Of course, Jonathan replied without defensiveness. Some people think I'm having a mental health crisis, others suspect this is a publicity stunt, and still others worry that I'm claiming a level of spiritual authority that I shouldn't. He had expected such responses and felt prepared to address them honestly. All I can do is tell the truth about what I experienced and let people draw their own conclusions. The most challenging criticism had come from some Christians who felt that claiming to experience something of Christ's passion was presumptuous or even blasphemous. I understand their concern, Jonathan said. The crucifixion is unique and unrepeatable, and I would never claim to have duplicated what Jesus actually accomplished. His response demonstrated theological sophistication and appropriate humility. But I don't think God was showing me anything new, just making ancient truths experientially real in a way that might encourage others. Tucker asked about how the experience had affected Jonathan's understanding of his own spiritual authority and calling. Do you feel like this experience has given you a special mission or platform? The question addressed the potential dangers of claiming extraordinary spiritual experiences, particularly in terms of ego and spiritual pride. If anything, the experience has made me more aware of my own limitations and need for grace, Jonathan replied thoughtfully. Experiencing even a fraction of what Christ endured has shown me how far I am from His perfection. He described feeling more called to humility than to any special authority. My role is simply to share what I experienced honestly and let the Holy Spirit use it however He chooses. The conversation turned to practical questions about how Jonathan's experience would affect his future career choices. Will this change the kinds of roles you're willing to take or the projects you want to be involved with? Tucker asked. The question addressed how profound spiritual experiences can reshape professional priorities and decisions. I think it will, though I'm still processing what that might look like, Jonathan admitted. It's hard to imagine taking roles that would contradict or minimize what I now understand about God's character and purposes. He described feeling a new responsibility to use his platform wisely, whether that was in The Chosen or in future projects. Every opportunity is now filtered through the question of whether it serves God's kingdom or just my own career. Tucker asked about any specific scripture passages that had taken on new meaning after Jonathan's experience. Are there verses that you read differently now? The question addressed how extraordinary spiritual experiences can illuminate biblical texts in new ways. The entire Passion narrative in all four Gospels feels completely different now. Jonathan replied immediately. But particularly Isaiah 53, the passage about the suffering servant who was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. He described reading those prophetic words with new understanding of their literal fulfillment. What I experienced helps me grasp that these weren't just metaphors or theological concepts, they were descriptions of actual spiritual and physical realities. The experience had also given Jonathan new appreciation for the Apostle Paul's writings about the cross. When Paul writes about the foolishness of the cross, or about being crucified with Christ, those phrases now carried experiential weight for me, he explained to Tucker. I understand better what it means to participate in Christ's sufferings and to find meaning in our own struggles through connection to his. As their conversation drew toward a close, Tucker asked about the lasting impact Jonathan hoped his story would have. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what do you hope people remember about what you've shared? The question addressed the long-term purpose and significance of publicly sharing such a profound personal experience. I hope people remember that God is still real, still active, still revealing himself to people who seek him, Jonathan replied with conviction. In a culture that often treats faith as outdated or irrelevant, I hope my experience serves as evidence that the spiritual realm is more real than anything we can see or touch. His desire was not for personal recognition, but for spiritual encouragement of others. The ripple effects of Jonathan's story were already beginning to manifest in unexpected ways. I've received messages from people all over the world sharing their own encounters with God, he told Tucker. It's as if my willingness to speak openly about the supernatural has given others permission to acknowledge their own experiences. The courage to discuss divine encounters seemed to be spreading organically. Tucker asked about any advice Jonathan would give to others who might have had their own spiritual experiences but were afraid to share them. What would you say to someone who has encountered God but is worried about the cost of speaking about it publicly? The question addressed the universal tension between spiritual authenticity and social acceptance. I would say that the truth is always worth sharing, even when it's costly, Jonathan replied. Not everyone needs to share their experiences as publicly as I have, but finding safe people to talk with about encounters with God is important for processing and growth. He emphasized the importance of spiritual community and wise counsel in discerning how to share extraordinary experiences. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than Tucker's typical interviews, but neither man seemed ready to end such a profound discussion. Jonathan, this has been unlike any interview I've ever conducted, Tucker admitted. Your account challenges people to consider possibilities that go far beyond normal religious discussion. The impact of the conversation was evident in Tucker's own demeanor, which had softened considerably from his usual confrontational style. Jonathan expressed gratitude for the opportunity to share his story in such depth. Tucker, I appreciate you giving me the space to talk about this honestly without trying to debunk or sensationalize it, he said. Too often, discussions about spiritual experiences get reduced to either uncritical acceptance or cynical dismissal. You've allowed for something more nuanced. The respectful treatment of his account had enabled a level of vulnerability that might not have been possible in other contexts. As they prepared to conclude, Tucker asked one final question that got to the heart of faith itself. For people watching this who are struggling with whether God exists or whether he cares about them personally, what would you want them to take from your experience? The question addressed the evangelistic dimension of Jonathan's testimony and its potential impact on seekers and skeptics. I would want them to know that the God I encountered on that cross is not distant or indifferent to human suffering, Jonathan replied with deep emotion. He doesn't stand apart from our pain. He entered into it fully. Every tear you've cried, every fear you've faced, every moment of despair you've endured, he has experienced all of it and more. His words carried the authority of someone who had glimpsed divine love firsthand. The theological implications of Jonathan's experience extended far beyond entertainment or even religion into questions about the nature of reality itself. If what I experienced is true, if God can break through into our physical world in ways that transcend normal experience, then everything changes, he told Tucker. Death isn't final, suffering isn't meaningless, and love really is the strongest force in the universe. The worldview implications were staggering in their scope and significance. As the interview concluded, both men sat in contemplative silence for several moments, processing the weight of what had been shared. The wooden cross still lay on the table between them, a physical reminder of the spiritual realities they had been discussing. "Thank you for having the courage to share this," Tucker finally said. "Whatever people make of your account, no one can say you haven't been honest about what you experienced. Have you ever experienced a moment when the sacred broke through into your ordinary life in ways you couldn't explain or control? Have you felt the presence of God so powerfully that it changed not just what you believed, but who you were at the deepest level?" Jonathan Roumie's encounter with the divine during the filming of the Crucifixion reminds us that God is still active in our world, still revealing himself to those who seek him, and still transforming lives through encounters with his love. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe that the supernatural is real, that God still meets people in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences happen when we're simply trying to faithfully represent the truth we've been given. Comment encounter below if this testimony has touched your heart and reminded you that faith is about relationship, not just religion.